Greetings, dear listener. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new scary stories and support me with a like. Enjoy listening.
Today, I will tell you a story that happened to me a year ago. That sleepless night I couldn't sleep at all. This was not the first time I watched my favorite films on the computer until the morning. At home, as luck would have it, I ran out of tea, coffee, and my favorite homemade cookies. I just can't live without them. The nearest convenience store is a 15-minute walk from my house. I had to get dressed and go. The night was moonlit. No one had lights on in the apartments. There was just silence. There was even a feeling that the city was extinct. It's rare to see this in general. I walked along the alley with lanterns that stood every 10 meters to illuminate my path. Somewhere in the distance you could hear dogs barking. The sound from them came closer and then moved away from me. There was not a soul in the store. Only the woman saleswoman was dozing, sitting on a chair. Having bought everything I needed, I headed home. Having lit a cigarette, I looked at my watch. The hands showed 1:15. The barking dogs were very close, but they were not visible. And at that moment I was enveloped in fear that arose from nowhere. No, I'm not afraid of dogs. The fear was completely different, inexplicable. I picked up my pace and wanted to get home as soon as possible. While I was walking, I began to scold myself for sneaking into the store at night. I would have been better off staying at home. Why such thoughts and fear visited me then? I don't know. After all, this was not the first time I had walked at night and had never experienced anything like this, but here it was. I was only about 100 meters from the entrance when I saw the dogs. There were 7 or 8 of them, maybe more. I couldn't really see because they were twisting and turning this way and that. I understood one thing for sure. They were moving in my direction, but somehow slowly. At some point I stopped to look and noticed that they were not spinning around a twig, as is usually the case, but around emptiness. A minute later, the pack of dogs was 3 meters away from me. They didn't bark at me. They barked looking up into the void, doing their best to prevent something invisible from approaching me. I can't understand why I just stood there and watched what was happening. I ran only when something forcefully threw one of the dogs aside. She whined loudly, fell, but immediately returned to the others. I ran without looking back. The dogs barked and whined. Impacts on the asphalt were heard. Apparently, something was throwing the 4-legged animals, and they made these sounds as they fell. I managed to open the intercom but did not have time to run into the entrance. Something or someone grabbed my leg. The pain was simply hellish. At that very second, I saw how the dogs began not only to bark. They rushed at something invisible and began to gnaw and tear. A wild roar was heard, but not of dogs, but of something else. It let me go, and at that moment I managed to run home. My leg felt like it was burned just below the knee. The prints of someone's hand and fingers, or something similar to fingers, could be seen. I had to call an ambulance. I told them that I scalded myself accidentally. While I was waiting for the ambulance, I decided to look out the window and look down. Maybe I'll see something. Dogs. They sat near the entrance in a semicircle. It seemed to me that they were licking their wounds, or maybe they were just licking their lips. Without barking, nothing else was heard or seen. The ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. I remember the doctors were very surprised when they saw the burn, but they really didn't ask anything. Having treated the damaged skin and given an injection, they told me to call a doctor in the morning to open a sick leave. The damage was severe. After all this, I somehow managed to fall asleep. The next day, the attending physician opened a sick leave. Closer to lunch, limping on one leg, I went out to the entrance to get some air and at the same time see if there were any traces left. A few drops of blood in front of the entrance and a cleaning lady muttering something under her breath. That's all. Having lit a cigarette, I saw several dogs that ran up to me wagging their tails, as if I were their owner. At that very moment, I realized that it was them, my saviors. Thanking them quietly, the dogs looked at me and ran away. A year has already passed, but I haven't seen those dogs anymore, and the wound still hurts. Not much, of course, but there are times when it becomes difficult. What kind of evil spirit it was? Who grabbed me? I probably won't even know. And to be honest, I don't want to. I really like to walk in the evening. Night, moon, quiet rustling of leaves. Agree, there is something unusual, exciting, enchanting in this. Life. It is so short and there is so much beauty in it. In general, I am one of those people who enjoy every moment of our short but bright life. Sorry, I'm not an article writer, so I write what I think. I developed a passion for walks under the moon in my childhood when, one evening in a village where there was no entertainment, I ran away from home just so as not to sleep. I walked through the forest. It was not dense, and I saw the sky in all its glory. The stars seemed to me like little fireflies flying in the sky. I looked and smiled. The moon always seemed to me to be the guardian of the night. It seemed to me that she was a kind auntie who looked at me and protected me. And I must admit, it was wonderful. I was happy to think that I was not alone and that besides me there were many different creatures in this forest. Unfortunately, it is impossible to return those days even for a moment. Sorry, I got distracted. Now I'm a grown guy. A lot of things have appeared in life. The internet, TV, and a lot of all kinds of entertainment, but nothing can replace night walks for me. And then one night I was walking through the arboretum. I listened to the sounds of nature, which were occasionally interrupted by the barking of dogs. Suddenly, a man about 55 years old pulled me back and asked if I had a cigarette. I was a little surprised, because I didn't expect to see a man at such a late hour, especially here, but I gave him a cigarette. He smiled, lit a cigarette, and sighed heavily, after which we were silent for about 5 minutes. I completely forgot that I was not alone, when suddenly he quietly said, "How beautiful." I answered, "Yes, it's beautiful." And we fell silent again for a while. He said in a quiet voice, "I don't want to leave this world." "Why leave him?" I asked. And he, exhaling heavily, told me the following. "My wife was ill. She died 15 years ago. I loved her very much. I took the loss very hard, drank, did not work. Friends forgot me. I left work. I hoped to fall asleep and not wake up. But one day I dreamed of my beloved. She asked me to let her go. I didn't understand what she meant. She said, 'Stop mourning me. I'm no longer with you and I won't get those days back. But this is not a hindrance to loving each other. Just let me go. Start working. Look who you look like. Stop drinking. You don't even have any friends left.' After which she quietly said, 'Next time I will come in a dream when your time comes.' That's why I will have to leave this world," the man said, and a tear rolled down his cheek. I looked at him pitifully, but he said, "Don't feel sorry for me. I'll be much better there because I'll see her again." I understood what he meant. We sat like that for about half an hour. I understood that I had to go, but I couldn't leave him. I sat for another 15 minutes, after which I stood up and said that it was time for me to go. He smiled and extended his hand to me with the words, "I'm Yura. It was nice to meet you." I shook his hand and said, "By the way, I'm Anton." Suddenly, a bright smile appeared on his face and he answered, "My best friend's name was Anton Tosha." I turned and calmly went my way, when suddenly he called out to me and said, laughing, "At least you need a cigarette. Leave it." I ran up, left the pack and lighter, laughed, and left. About 2 years have passed. I have never seen Yura since then, and I think I will never see him again. But I haven't stopped walking under the starry sky and probably never will. Here, https://jutco.ro/odnoklasnika, the most terrible stories from life. This story happened recently, literally a week ago, maybe a little more. It cannot be called scary and mystical, but it does suggest certain thoughts and guesses. I had a weekend, and my friend and I decided to go visit my brother and his girlfriend, sit, chat, listen to music, and let's be honest, drink a little. We arrived at my brother and his girlfriend's place at about 9 o'clock in the evening and stayed until almost 4 a.m., after which we decided that we would go home, although we were invited to stay the night, but we thought that it would be a good idea to take a walk since the high spirits I was in the mood for such a spontaneous walk. We got dressed, said goodbye, and left. The walk to the house took about 40 minutes, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on the speed of walking. We walked briskly, sometimes exchanging a few words, sometimes just strashno.com silently, each walking in our own thoughts. We knew that there would soon be a city cemetery on our way, and we had the choice of either going through it or going around and making a detour, thereby lengthening our path. Previously, we had already had the opportunity to cut through this cemetery, but it was during the day. At night, I, like my friend, had never had to be in such a place. Soon we reached the cemetery. I had already decided for sure that I would go through it, but my friend still had doubts. But his doubts did not last long, and soon we were already entering the night cemetery. The gate, however, could not be found right away. From the very first second in the cemetery, I felt such an unusual energy, or maybe it was just a rush of adrenaline. There was darkness ahead. A road was visible several meters ahead, which was illuminated by the moon strashno.com, and at the same time, from this moon on the sides of the road, gravestone plaques with the names and dates of birth and death of people glittered. The weather was quiet and calm. The city seemed to have ceased to exist, considering that the cemetery is right in the center of the city, and you can see tall buildings along the entire perimeter of the cemetery. We walked along a straight cemetery road, shared our emotions with each other, looked around, but not back. Intuitively, we didn't want to look back. Somehow the thought made us feel uncomfortable. We walk forward for about 2 minutes. Nothing happens. After a while, we come to an intersection. Turning left is the exit from the cemetery. Turning right is further into the cemetery. We are already starting to approach the turn to the left when a friend suddenly turns around and I follow him, and a fox runs after us. At first it was just two brilliant strashno.com eyes in the dark, and when we turned on the flashlight on the phone, we realized who was in front of us. The fox's behavior was strange. She was not afraid and ran at a trot, getting closer and closer to us. We decided to intimidate her and began to stomp, wave our legs while trying not to slow down the pace of walking. The exit from the cemetery had already appeared, and we just had to walk in a straight line again. I had already turned my face to the fox and my back to the exit and walked in such a way as to control it, since it did not lag behind and was not afraid. We had already begun to approach the exit from the cemetery, and only then the forest disappeared from our view among the graves and trees. When we left the cemetery and walked home, we simply talked and made our own hypotheses, not excluding the possibility that it could be the keeper of the cemetery, and his goal was to drive us insolent people out. Or maybe it was just strashno.com. It was an ordinary fox who wanted to beg for food. Anything is possible. We walked along a straight cemetery road, shared our emotions with each other, looked around, but not back. Intuitively, we didn't want to look back. Somehow the thought made us feel uncomfortable. We walk forward for about 2 minutes. Nothing happens. After a while, we come to an intersection. Turning left is the exit from the cemetery. Turning right is further into the cemetery. We are already starting to approach the turn to the left when a friend suddenly turns around and I follow him, and a fox runs after us. At first, it was just two brilliant strashno.com eyes in the dark, and when we turned on the flashlight on the phone, we realized who was in front of us. The fox's behavior was strange. She was not afraid and ran at a trot, getting closer and closer to us. We decided to intimidate her and began to stomp, wave our legs while trying not to slow down the pace of walking. The exit from the cemetery had already appeared, and we just had to walk in a straight line again. I had already turned my face to the fox and my back to the exit and walked in such a way as to control it, since it did not lag behind and was not afraid. We had already begun to approach the exit from the cemetery, and only then the forest disappeared from our view among the graves and trees. When we left the cemetery and walked home, we simply talked and made our own hypotheses, not excluding the possibility that it could be the keeper of the cemetery, and his goal was to drive us insolent people out. Or maybe it was just strashno.com. It was an ordinary fox who wanted to beg for food. Anything is possible. I love walks at night. Pleasant air, lack of noise, and large numbers of people make this time simply wonderful for such a pastime. I'm walking along the central alley of the city. The lanterns illuminate it very well. The trees lower their crowns so low that you involuntarily touch them with your head. The wind got stronger. A package flew past me. Fly, proud bird. Suddenly the lantern next to me went out, but I didn't attach much importance to it. With our electrical networks, it's not like the lights and transformers burn out. And then, when I was almost out of the blind spot, someone shouted my name from behind. I turned around. The lantern that had gone out was shining brightly. There was a bench under him, and a guy was sitting on it. He shouted my name again. I looked around. There was no one on the alley except me and this guy. He was wearing a striped sweatshirt with a dark green hood pulled over his face, dirty jeans, and clean white sneakers. Yes, you, come here, he told me. What do you want? I told him. There is a point, he said. I'm not here for any business, I told him, and moved on. The mood was irrevocably ruined. I don't like talking to people at night. It's my time. Not wanting to walk along the alley anymore, I decided to walk through the nearest park since it was only a short walk away. The park is divided into two parts, the central road and the road along the fence. They differ only in size and degree of grooming and amenities. The central road is small, barely reaching the middle of the park, but it is always clean and all the plants are well groomed. There are even a couple of cafes. On the road along the fence, the opposite is true. There's wildlife there. Even part of the sidewalk has already become paths, and I like this track better. Silence and nature. I walked along it, enjoying the views, when suddenly I tripped over something. I looked down and was stunned. It was the corpse of a girl, quite large and tall. I, not even a doctor, immediately realized that she had been killed because her neck was at an unnatural angle and there was a huge pool of blood around it. "Do you like it?" someone said from behind. I turned around. It was the same guy who called me in the alley. He stood with his elbows on a tree and wiped the knife on his sweatshirt. "And why did you do this?" I told him. "Well, it's good that it was a dream," I thought, and looked at the door. A striped sweatshirt was drying on her. There was a knife stuck in the door. I want to tell you a story that left a mark on my life. One might say, changed it once and for all. 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to work in the Siberian forests on a shift. The work consisted of the following. Once a month for a week, we were thrown into the wilderness about 70 kilometers from the nearest populated area. And even that was a remote village with broken, rickety houses, where at most 20 old people lived. We had to prepare a hut and a bathhouse for the men, who, in turn, cut down the forest 3 weeks a month. We chopped wood, replenished the water supply from a nearby stream, and repaired buildings. There was a lot of work to do, and there were only 2 of us, me and my partner. Not everyone will like this kind of work. Yes, they paid well, but still it was only a part-time job, and my partners often changed, giving up this damn job to others. And now I understand that I should have paid attention to this. So one of these watches brought me together with a young guy named Slavka. Tall, strong, a typical hard worker. It was winter, in December. The cold had not yet set in, but it was freezing well, and the snow was already lying in knee-deep snowdrifts throughout the forest. The driver dropped us off at the hut and drove off. They decided to work from the next day, but in the meantime, get comfortable in the place, have a drink and talk, get to know each other. I must say that Slava was not a particularly talkative guy. He seemed intelligent, seemed kind, but he still listened more than he spoke. To be honest, I don't like this in people. Well, let it be. It's not for me to judge. We drank, talked, seemed to need to go to bed, and he pulled on his clothes. I asked him, "Where are you going for the night?" "Yes, I'll take a short walk before bed and come." Strange, but oh well, I thought, turned away and fell asleep. I woke up. It was still dark. Slava pushes me and says, "Get ready, it's time to work." Having distributed the responsibilities between the two, we went to work. I had to cut an ice hole in the stream from where they would then draw water, and Slava had to start chopping wood. I came out onto a small stream about 4 meters wide. It was located behind a hillock from the hut in a small gorge. On both sides of the stream there was a pine forest. The stream was covered with a thick crust of ice, and it was remarkable that the path to it was trodden. Otherwise, we would have had to walk through snowdrifts. A slightly icy ice hole was visible in the middle of the stream. Apparently, the men, having steamed in the bathhouse, often ran to swim in this stream. That's why the path is wide and the ice hole is large, not really frozen. I cut it down with an axe and, having filled 2 buckets with water, went to the hut. Slavka was busy wielding his axe in the yard, having already chopped a fair amount of logs. I already thought that perhaps we could get it done in less than a week, and we'd even be able to rest before leaving. Having filled several tanks completely, I decided to go for water for the last time that day and then rest because it was already getting dark, and I didn't really want to work in the dark. When I went down to the stream, I noticed this detail. Footprints stretched towards the ice hole from the opposite bank. Of course, I was very surprised, but still thought that I might not have noticed these traces earlier, and that most likely they were left by the men from their shift. Well, you never know who needed to go where, but I just didn't pay attention all day. Anything can happen. I calmed myself down with this thought, took some water, and went to the hut. Moreover, he convinced himself so much that he didn't even ask Slava whether these were his tracks. But on the other hand, he had nothing to do by the stream. The evening was spent in silence. No one talked about anything. Everyone was doing their own thing. I was reading a book, and Slava was lying on the bed and silently looking at the ceiling. Apparently, he was thinking about something. Before going to bed, Slavka began to dress silently, just like the previous evening. I asked, "Are you going to breathe air again?" He chuckled gloomily and slammed the door behind him. I don't like such silent and withdrawn people, and even more so, being alone with them in the taiga. But nothing can be done. The shift needs to be finalized. I was immersed in the book again and didn't notice how an hour or an hour and a half had passed. Looking at my watch, I was very surprised. Was he really running around the forest somewhere in the dark? Where and why does he go? Get some air? But it takes about 15 minutes at most. Throwing on a pea coat, I went out onto the porch to smoke a cigarette and looked around the dark forest. His eyes didn't cling to anything. Slavka had really gone off somewhere. Nothing is seen or heard around. I was a little scared. Was he lost? But there was no desire to go look for him. I went to bed and fell asleep again after a hard day. In the morning, Slava woke me up again. I squirmed in bed and reluctantly began to get ready to go outside. When asked where he had been for so long yesterday, he answered vaguely, "Walking." That's where we parted ways. I filled up the water again and he was still chopping wood. Already during the day something happened that alarmed and frightened me. I again went to the stream for water and again noticed all the same traces. I was thinking about them while collecting water and accidentally let the bucket slip out of my hands. It sank to the bottom. Taking off my pea coat and rolling up my sleeves, I began to search the bottom of the stream with my hands. It's good that the stream was shallow. The bucket was only slightly carried away by the current. After 10 minutes of effort, I finally pulled him out of the stream and began to wrap myself in a pea coat. After swearing, I took the buckets and turned to go to the hut, and then I noticed new tracks. They came from the same bank where I came from, but a little to the right of my path. The tracks came from the forest. They definitely weren't here before. This means that during those 10 minutes that I was poking around with the bucket, someone came out of the forest, looked at me, and went back. I peered into the forest but saw nothing. I got goosebumps. It was extremely unpleasant to realize this whole situation, and the only thing I could do was to assume that Slavka was coming. I rushed to the hut. Slava was chopping wood. I asked him if it was him, but he denied it and, most likely, generally thought that I was making fun of him. I took him to the ice hole and showed him the tracks. We both scratched our heads, smoked, speculated, but found no explanation. After all, the nearest village, as I already wrote, was very far from us, and even if someone came or passed by, we could not help but notice it. After all, there is only one road. From then on, we decided to walk in twos, but we didn't go for water that day. We decided to finish with the firewood. The evening of that day passed calmly. This time, Slavka stayed in the hut. Most likely, he also felt uneasy, and we sat all evening and discussed where these ill-fated traces could come from. We worked as a couple in the morning. The first half of the day was spent carrying water. The second half was chopping wood. We have finished most of the work. That day passed without incident, except that in the evening Slavka got ready to go somewhere again, and the thought that he would again go into the dark forest for several hours to walk in an unknown place through huge snowdrifts made me feel uneasy. Or maybe he's walking along the road that leads to our hut, but this still doesn't make it any easier. Moreover, these traces are incomprehensible. Maybe you'll stay after all? After all, we still didn't understand where these traces came from, I told him. I'll be there soon, he muttered, and walked out the door. He never returned that night. After waiting for him for 3 or 4 hours, I despaired and went to bed. I didn't want to go out into the forest and look for him. The next morning he was gone too. I was worried, very worried. I went out into the forest and tried to find him for half a day, but I never saw any traces. Then I thought that he had nevertheless gone along the well-worn road that led towards the village. But after walking along it for several kilometers, I did not find anyone and realized that I was very tired, since I'd been on my feet since the morning. Only one thought came into my head. Maybe he went to the village and got drunk there? Yes, the thought was funny, and there was no way this could happen, but it somehow consoled me, and that was enough. I couldn't do anything. There was no point in even thinking about communication in the taiga. The car was supposed to arrive for us in 3 days. Of course, I understood that a person's life was in danger, and just in case, I decided to walk around the hut again through the forest. Maybe I'd come across some traces. But, having examined the surroundings, I again did not find either Slavic or any traces of him. It was already getting dark, and I belatedly realized that in the morning I should have run on foot to the village and called the rescuers. I decided to return to the hut and get up early in the morning and move to the village. As I approached the hut, I had an uneasy feeling. My head was spinning with unanswered questions. What happened to Slavic? Where did he go? Where did you disappear to? Where do these marks at the ice hole come from? I went into the hut, lit the stove, and began to warm myself. After some time, I was pulled out of my thoughts by footsteps on the street. Someone was walking through the snow towards the door. I was as happy as a child. With a cry, "Slavka!" I jumped, ran to the exit, opened the door, and leaned out into the street, and my joy instantly gave way to horror. On the steps to the hut stood, no, it was hardly a man. I still can't understand what came across me face to face then. Even in the warm light from the hut, because of the door I opened, his face was deathly white. In the place where the eyes should have been, there were black hollow circles, so black that at first it seemed to me that there were no eyes at all. But looking closer, I saw 2 black beads in place of the eyes. But even these eyes were not as scary as his mouth. It was huge, as if it had been cut with a knife from ear to ear. It felt like he was grinning. The teeth were sharp, like fangs. He was completely bald, and his skin was so wrinkled as if he had been in water for a week. He was enormous in stature, as he stood several steps lower than me, but his head was 1 step higher than mine.